Fort Belvedere, Surrey. Shortly before 2 in the afternoon, December the 10th, 1936, Edward VIII signs the Instrument of Abdication at his weekend residence in Windsor Great Park. His 3 younger brothers are in the room as witnesses, including the second oldest, Prince Albert, who will be king by morning. Albert goes home and writes in his diary. His authorized biographer, John Wheeler-Bennett, who had privileged access to those diaries, quotes him describing what it felt like to see the crown coming at him. Like being led, in his own words, like the proverbial sheep to the slaughter. Earlier that same day, Albert had told his cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, "Dickie, this is absolutely terrible. I am quite unprepared for it. I have never even seen a state paper. I am only a naval officer. It's the only thing I know about." That wasn't false modesty. George V had consistently refused his second son access to Foreign Office correspondence. Even Edward, as Prince of Wales and heir apparent, had seen only a carefully screened selection of documents. When Albert became George VI on December 11th, he searched the palace archives and found what one contemporary account describes as no real manual or guidance on constitutional or political matters. Nothing beyond Walter Bagehot's general essays on the Constitution, written for a general readership, not an emergency briefing for a new monarch. A man had taken the throne of the British Empire essentially cold, and the fact that no one had thought to prepare him was itself undocumented, unremarked, nobody's formal responsibility, until it became everybody's crisis. He was 40 years old. His daughters were 10 and 6. Princess Elizabeth, born the 21st of April, 1926, was now heir presumptive. Princess Margaret, born the 21st of August, 1930, was second in line. And the father who had wept in front of his mother, who had described himself as a sheep walking into slaughter, who had told Mountbatten he had never seen a state paper, that father was now responsible for ensuring his children didn't face what he had faced. He made that decision. He made it for one of them. From around 1938, Elizabeth was given systematic constitutional training. She sat with her father while he worked through his red dispatch boxes of state correspondence. She was sent, twice weekly, to the vice provost of Eton College for formal instruction in constitutional history and law. Margaret wasn't included in any of this. Margaret continued the curriculum that both girls had been receiving since the early 1930s, with the balance shifting increasingly toward the skills expected of a princess who would marry into a prominent household, rather than one who would inherit a throne. The question of why that split was made, by people who had just watched an untrained heir stumble into one of the most consequential moments in 20th century British history, shaped both girls for the remaining 60 years of their lives. Marion Crawford arrived at the family's London townhouse at 145 Piccadilly sometime in the early 1930s. Most sources place the appointment around 1932 or 1933. Wikipedia's article on Crawford gives her years of service as 1933 to 1949, while Tatler places her arrival when Elizabeth was 6, which would be 1932. The records conflict precisely enough that false precision isn't warranted. She was Scottish, middle class, a graduate of Edinburgh University's Moray House Institute, who had been working as a summer governess for Lord Elgin's household when the Duchess of York, a distant relative of Elgin, found her. She was given charge of Princess Elizabeth's education, and eventually Margaret's as well. She stayed approximately 16 years. She published a memoir called The Little Princesses in 1950, without palace approval, which ended her connection to the royal family permanently. Servants who went public for money afterward were said to be doing a Crawfie. Her schoolroom descriptions, however, haven't been disputed on factual grounds by anyone who was actually there. The rooms she ran occupied different spaces as the family moved. Before 1936, it was set in a boudoir off the main drawing room at 145 Piccadilly. After December 1936, it moved to the old schoolroom at the top of Buckingham Palace, overlooking the Mall. During the war years, lessons continued at Windsor Castle, where the drinking water in carafes by the princesses' bedsides sometimes froze overnight in the first winters. Before 1936, what the girls received looked like this: arithmetic, grammar, writing, history, and geography. General, not specialized, plus art, dancing, and French conversation, handled by Madame Montadon Smith. Music was taught separately. Both Elizabeth and Margaret had piano lessons with Mabel Lander, a respected British concert pianist. Elizabeth began at 8 in 1934, Margaret at 7 in 1937, and both continued through the mid-1940s with the same teacher. The curriculum was light by any comparative standard of the period. Contemporary accounts repeatedly note the gap between what the princesses received in Crawford's schoolroom and what their male contemporaries were receiving at Eton or comparable preparatory schools, and that gap was acknowledged at the time, not merely in retrospect. Queen Mary, the girls' grandmother, was described in Crawford's memoir as troubled by this. The surviving text fragment describes her concern as a worry, though the full passage isn't recoverable from available extracts. What is recoverable is the Duchess of York's documented response when Queen Mary pressed the importance of a more rigorous education. "I don't know what she meant. After all, I and my sisters only had governesses, and we all married well. One of us very well." Randolph Churchill, writing at the time, captured the prevailing philosophy more bluntly. The Duchess never aimed at bringing her daughters up to be more than nicely behaved young ladies. This was the baseline for both girls simultaneously. No deliberate advantage, no deliberate disadvantage. Simply the standard domestic curriculum of upper-class British girlhood, thin by serious comparative standards. The critical point is that before 1936, Elizabeth and Margaret were receiving essentially the same education. The 1938 split wasn't the correction of an existing imbalance, it was the creation of a new one. On December 12, 1936, George VI addressed the Accession Council at St. James's Palace. "I meet you today in circumstances which are without parallel in the history of our country." In the House of Commons 2 days later, his message was read. "I have succeeded to the throne in circumstances which are without precedent, and at a moment of great personal distress. But I am resolved to do my duty." The night before the abdication was legally complete, he had gone to see Queen Mary at Marlborough House. His diary records the moment. "When I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child." In the months and years that followed, he learned in real time what had been kept from him by design. George V had believed that information was power and had not shared it with his sons. The new king found in palace archives no real guidance on constitutional or political matters, and relied heavily on ministers and officials to work out what his role actually required. He started the weekly private lunches with the Prime Minister that became one of the most important instruments of the constitutional monarchy. He discovered, through practice, what he should have been taught. Harold Wilson would later remark that attending a weekly audience with the Queen unprepared was like being caught at school without having done your homework. The standard she set was rooted in what her father had built after 1936. He began sitting Elizabeth with him while he worked through the red dispatch boxes, the leather-covered cases carrying state correspondence that arrived at the palace daily, and which every prime minister prepared with the understanding that the sovereign would read each one. Elizabeth later described this as foundational. "I have a feeling that in the end, Probably that training is the answer to a great many things. If I missed one once, I would never get it straight again. The dispatch boxes were practical immersion. What George VI arranged next was formal instruction. A well-watched video about the royal schoolroom spells the tutor's name Marten. The correct spelling is Marten, M-A-R-T-E-N. Every authoritative source, Eton College's own records, the Cambridge University Library Archival Catalogue, the Eton Fives Association obituary, the Wikipedia article on the man himself, uses Marten consistently. The Marten spelling is a documented error appearing in a newsreel voiceover and reproduced in at least one otherwise respectable publication. Getting the name right is the minimum requirement for discussing what he actually taught. Sir Henry Marten was born in Kensington on the 28th of October, 1872, the son of Sir Alfred Marten, a barrister, judge, and former Member of Parliament for Cambridge Borough. Henry attended Eton as a pupil, matriculated at Balliol College, Oxford in 1891, and graduated in 1895 with a first-class degree in modern history, returning to Eton that same year to teach at the invitation of headmaster Edmund Warre. He was a founder member of the Historical Association in 1906. He co-authored The Groundwork of British History in 1912, a text the Cambridge Archival Catalogue describes as one of the most used school textbooks of the first half of the 20th century. He became housemaster in 1907, lower master from 1925 to 1929, and vice provost from 1929, all confirmed in the Cambridge University Library's record of his papers. He didn't become provost until 1945. Sources that call him provost during the 1938 lessons are running 7 years ahead of the facts. The Cambridge Archive is specific about the appointment. In 1938, Marten was entrusted by George VI with the historical education of the Princess Elizabeth. Entrusted by George VI. The initiative came from the father. Marten's core text was William Anson's The Law and Custom of the Constitution, not a textbook written for general audiences, but the standard professional reference for constitutional practice, a serious legal and historical exposition that any constitutional lawyer of the period would recognize as the definitive working document of British constitutional law. Marten tested Elizabeth on it systematically. He had spent decades training Eton boys to read history as a live discipline rather than a record of events, and he applied that same approach to the Constitution, teaching it not as a set of rules to memorize, but as a framework for understanding what a constitutional monarchy was, structurally, for. Two organizing principles run through every account of what he instilled. First, the absolute political neutrality required of a constitutional monarch in relation to elected governments. Second, the growing significance of radio and film in communicating with the public. Both proved prescient. The significance of broadcast media, which Marten identified as central to the modern monarch's relationship with the public, was borne out by Elizabeth's entire reign. The coronation, televised in 1953, watched by 27 million viewers. The 1969 documentary, Royal Family, which showed the royals cooking a barbecue at Balmoral. The Christmas broadcast that became a national institution. He prepared her to think about that relationship between monarchy and media 17 years before the coronation. He taught her twice a week throughout this period. Where the lessons took place is, oddly, one of the few things that credible sources disagree on. The Evening Standard and a Vogue obituary of the Queen describe Elizabeth visiting Marten at his study near Eton College. Debrett's gives a different picture. Marten arriving at Windsor in a book-laden dog cart. Robert Lacey's Queen and Country suggests Marten made regular visits, implying he came to her. Both versions have been repeated by reliable sources, and it's possible the arrangement varied by season or circumstance. What is consistent across every account is the twice-weekly frequency, and the Debrett's image, a vice provost of Eton arriving at Windsor in a dog cart with his books piled alongside, has the kind of vividness that tends to survive. As a teacher, Marten was notably eccentric. His study contained a pet raven. 40 years of addressing Eton boys had embedded the word gentleman so deeply in his professional reflexes that he sometimes addressed Elizabeth the same way, catching himself mid-sentence. His own voice, preserved in a Time magazine period piece, offers one direct quotation. "We English are very slow, and we never rush into anything." He died unmarried on December 11, 1948, at the Provost's Lodge at Eton, aged 76. He bequeathed his book collection to Eton, where it forms the Marten Library. George VI had knighted him on the steps of Eton College Chapel on the 4th of March, 1945, an event the Eton records describe as the first knighthood ever conferred at Eton. Elizabeth was approximately 12 when the tutorials began, turning 13 in April 1939. For the first time in her life, she was receiving something that resembled professional instruction in statecraft. Her sister, that same year, was 7, turning 8 in August. Margaret wasn't included. Tim Heald's biography, Princess Margaret, A Life Unraveled, published in 2007, drawing on Royal Archives material, is direct about this. Yet when Sir Henry Marten came driving up the hill to conduct tutorials with Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret Rose was still not allowed to sit in on them. This always irritated her. Was still not allowed. That passive construction carries weight. Not wasn't invited or didn't attend, wasn't allowed. Something or someone had considered the question of Margaret's presence at the constitutional tutorials and had answered it with a standing prohibition. The irritation was persistent, which means the question arose more than once and was answered the same way each time. What she continued receiving was the shared Crawford curriculum, with the balance shifting increasingly toward accomplishments. Singing, at which she was genuinely exceptional, Lady Anne Glenconner, who later served as her lady-in-waiting and gave testimony in a BBC documentary, stated directly that she believed Margaret's education had been put on the back burner so that she could serve Elizabeth wholeheartedly, and remembered how she knew all the Scottish folk songs. Piano, the Royal.UK biography, states she began lessons by age 4 and became an accomplished pianist. French conversation. From 1942, when the Vicomtesse Antoinette de Bellagui, a Belgian aristocrat who had escaped occupied Europe, joined the royal household to teach French literature and continental history to both sisters, which means French eventually became shared ground rather than a dividing line. That shared element matters. Elizabeth also continued her piano lessons with Mabel Lander throughout this period. The partition wasn't between a cultured education and a deficient one. Margaret received a real education in the accomplishments of a well-born woman of her era. She was socially accomplished, genuinely musical, literate in French and in European culture, well-read by any casual measure. The specific gap was constitutional substance. Elizabeth received that on top of the accomplishments curriculum. Margaret received the accomplishments, and the constitutional education was simply absent. History Extra, the BBC's specialist history publication, records that all her life she would regret her lack of education, adding that in later years she would visit museums and make notes on objects and paintings in order to study them afterward. A woman in her 60s and 70s, standing in front of canvases and artifacts with a notebook, compensating through private effort for what had been left out of 1938. No royal diary entry, no letter, no court circular recording the reasoning behind Margaret's exclusion from constitutional training has been published or identified in the archival record. Historical records confirm the gap. References to the start of Marten's teaching are retrospective descriptions in biographies, rather than cited to any specific archival document. The language secondary sources use is telling in its grammar. She was excluded. She wasn't allowed. Descriptive, not documentary. If there was a formal decision, it was never written down. Against that consensus stands a 1948 document worth examining directly. When Sir Henry Marten died at Eton in December 1948, the New York Times published an obituary headlined, "Sir Henry Marten, Princess's Tutor, Eton College Provost, taught Elizabeth and Margaret law. Historian, author, dies." The text states that Marten had provided instruction in constitutional law to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. That is a contemporary document, published while the events it describes were recent, by a newspaper with access to sources no longer recoverable. It isn't a retrospective biography drawing on memory. A YouTube channel called Royal Skeletons, in a video examining Princess Margaret's household relationships, states that Margaret was schooled in constitutional history. That claim may rest on the Times obituary, or on something derived from it. Against it stands a more substantial body of evidence. Heald's biography, with Royal Archives access, states that Margaret wasn't allowed to attend and that this always irritated her. Persistent irritation that does not easily coexist with having received equivalent instruction elsewhere. History Extra confirms exclusion explicitly. Royal.uk, Debrett's, and the published account in Royal Sisters, Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, all treat constitutional training as Elizabeth's alone. Royal Sisters states directly that Margaret was excluded in these one-to-one studies. The Wikipedia article on Princess Margaret records that she developed her skills in singing and playing the piano during the war years, framing her wartime education in accomplishments rather than constitutional studies. The most plausible reading of the Times obituary is that a 1948 writer used Elizabeth and Margaret to describe Marten's significance as a royal educator in general terms, rather than specifying that both girls received identical instruction. Newspaper obituaries of the period routinely used such compressed, inclusive language when describing a subject's royal associations. It's also possible that Marten had incidental educational contact with Margaret during palace visits, a question answered in passing, a brief exchange, that a period writer generalized. The weight of biographical evidence, particularly Heald with his archival access, supports the position that Elizabeth received systematic constitutional training from Marten and Margaret didn't. The Times obituary is a genuine outlier and should be named rather than ignored. If further primary sources emerge, a letter from Marten, a palace document, they should change this assessment. On the current record, the exclusion is the better supported conclusion. The question of why the lesson the family drew from December 1936 applied to one daughter and not the other has a specific answer, and it deserves to be stated rather than implied. In 1938, what George VI understood himself to have learned from the abdication was narrow and concrete. The heir to the throne needed constitutional training. Elizabeth was the heir. The lesson therefore applied to Elizabeth. This wasn't a failure of generalization. It was the precise application of the problem as he had experienced it. He had told Mountbatten he'd never seen a state paper. The solution was to make sure his heir saw state papers. His heir was Elizabeth. Margaret's future, from any vantage point available in 1938, mapped to a different trajectory. Marriage, title, social function, the life of a well-placed princess in a well-placed household. The scenario in which Margaret's constitutional knowledge would be required at the level her father's had been required, in which she might be called unexpectedly to a function demanding that knowledge, wasn't foreseeable in 1938, so nobody planned for it. There is also an institutional dimension. The family had absorbed from the abdication crisis not just the lesson about preparation, but the lesson about what happens when a royal's personal conduct collides with the monarchy's structural requirements. They had watched the crown come close to dissolution over a divorce. Their response was to make the heir's training as thorough as possible, and to make the spare's preparation equally thorough, but thorough for a different purpose. There was no neglect. There was an assumption about what each daughter's life would require, and one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong. In 1945, Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. She worked through the ranks as a driver and mechanic, took the same tests as other ATS members, and was promoted to junior commander. Margaret watched from Windsor and was barely able to contain herself. She was 14. The gap between what her sister was doing and what was available to her had become visible in a new way, and she felt it. The war years at Windsor had been, paradoxically, among the more structurally comfortable of her childhood, because the family was together and her role wasn't yet required to be defined. She performed in the Christmas pantomimes the princesses staged in aid of the Queen's Wool Fund, productions with lines, costumes, and staging, performed before audiences that included soldiers stationed at Windsor. She sang, she played piano, she entertained. Her father allowed her liberties that raised eyebrows, staying up to dinner at 13, treated as the family's source of delight in a way that was structurally distinct from Elizabeth's role as heir. George VI had described Elizabeth as his pride and Margaret as his joy. The distinction wasn't cruel, it was structural. And in 1945, when Elizabeth began driving military trucks and Margaret could only watch, the structural difference between pride and joy became unmistakable. When George VI died on the 6th of February 1952, Margaret was 21. Elizabeth became queen at 25. The life that had been planned for Margaret, marriage, household, social function, was now the life of the sister of a monarch, which is a significantly more constrained version of the life that was envisioned. She didn't marry Peter Townsend. He was the RAF officer she loved, a decorated Battle of Britain pilot who had served as the king's equerry, appointed by George VI himself to a position George VI evidently valued. He was also divorced. The constitutional impossibility of the match was complete. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England, which didn't allow the remarriage of divorced people in church while a former spouse was living. And any legislation enabling the marriage would have required Margaret to renounce her place in the succession and her royal income. She issued her statement in October 1955. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth. She gave him up. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones in May 1960. They divorced in 1978. She received a Kensington Palace apartment and no work that drew on anything Marten had given Elizabeth or the dispatch box Sessions had built. Tim Heald's biography documents her public life in enough detail to establish that she carried out genuine official engagements across more than 50 years. But there was no defined constitutional function, no weekly audiences, no state papers, no work that required her to understand how the mechanisms of government actually operated. In 1975, Gore Vidal turned 50 and held his birthday dinner at Mark's Club in Mayfair. Among his guests, Kenneth Tynan, Tom Dryburgh, Ryan O'Neill, Jonathan Miller, Claire Bloom, Lady Antonia Fraser, Harold Pinter. Princess Margaret attended, placed between Vidal and Tennessee Williams. Williams opened by saying he was afraid they couldn't talk to each other because they lived in such different worlds. When she asked which world he meant, he said La Bohème. It was, as Craig Brown documents in Ma'am Darling, not a productive pairing. She had told Cecil Beaton privately some years earlier that she loathed plays like A Streetcar Named Desire. I hate squalor. Tennessee Williams makes me feel ill. Vidal managed better. Brown records an exchange in which Vidal told Margaret that Jackie Kennedy had found the Queen pretty heavy-going in conversation. Margaret's reply, "But that's what she's there for." It's a line that contains real intelligence about the function of the monarchy, a precise understanding of why ceremonial gravity serves a constitutional purpose, and why ease isn't the point. Brown's organizing frame for her life, assembled from 99 such glimpses, is the word disappointment. Not as Margaret's self-description to Vidal, which the available extracts don't confirm in those specific words, but as what she came, in his reading, to represent. Disappointment hiding behind the shield of hauteur, keeping pity at bay, is how he describes her social persona. One friend told Brown he had never known an unhappier woman. Her own account of the structural situation was precise. In testimony collected from people who knew her, she described it this way: "When there are two sisters and one is the Queen, who must be the source of honor and all that is good, the other must be the focus of the most creative malice." She had identified the dynamic accurately. She had lived inside it since the schoolroom established, in 1938, that one of them would understand how things worked, and one of them would be charming. In 1998, the strokes began, the first following burns from a hot bath. By March 2001, a major stroke had left her partially paralyzed and wheelchair-dependent. She died on the 9th of February 2002 at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, of cardiac complications following a further stroke. She was 71. History Extra notes that in her later years, she visited museums and made notes on objects and paintings to study them afterward. A woman in her 70s, with a notebook, still trying to fill what had been left out in 1938. No document from 1938 records the reasoning that produced the curriculum split. No letter from George VI, no diary entry, no court minute. The Cambridge archives place the Marten engagement in the king's hands, entrusted by George VI. For the mirror decision about Margaret, nothing comparable exists. The language in secondary sources is consistently descriptive, rather than documentary. She wasn't allowed to attend. She was excluded. Nobody said on the record why. When the reasoning is obvious enough to everyone in the room, you don't write it down. 2 girls, 1 schoolroom, 1 corridor between them at the top of Buckingham Palace. One was taken down, to a man who either arrived in a book-laden dog-cart or received her in a study near the college, twice a week, depending on which account is more reliable, and taught how a constitution works, what a dispatch box contains, why a monarch reads every paper in it. Taught from Anson's text on the law and custom of the Constitution. Taught by a vice provost who had spent 40 years addressing boys he called gentlemen and who sometimes forgot. Taught by her father, the man who had told Mountbatten he'd never seen a state paper, to never miss a day with the boxes. The other stayed with the curriculum she already had. Piano, which Elizabeth also played, a distinction the standard narrative overstates. Singing, at which she was genuinely exceptional. French conversation, which from 1942 both sisters shared with the same teacher. The accomplishments of a princess expected to make a good marriage. She was equipped for that life with genuine care. She wasn't equipped for any other. The plan for her didn't survive contact with the century. She never married the man she wanted. She was given a title, an allowance, a 20-room apartment at Kensington Palace, and no work that required her to understand how any of it functioned. She made notes on museum objects in her 70s so she could study them afterward. Gore Vidal said she was far too intelligent for her station in life. She spent 40 years in a station that had no constitutional definition and no settled purpose. Whatever else the family got wrong about Margaret, it began in 1938, with a decision about who needed to understand things and who only needed to be charming. The man who made that decision had written in his diary about sheep being led to slaughter. He had told his cousin he'd never seen a state paper. He made sure his heir saw every one. He stopped there. If you want more stories told with this level of care for the sources, subscribing helps us make them.